Unfortunately, few people realize that, in fact, the tale of Peter Pan is strictly not recommended to be read to children. As for the adults, well, if you like stories about kidnapping, split personality, and perverts, then this one's for you. You're probably checking the title of the video right now to make sure you didn't make a mistake by clicking on it. Yes, that's exactly what the cute at first glance fairy tale about the boy from Neverland really is. So, what is hidden in the fairy tale Peter Pan? Written either by an impotent stalker obsessed with young boys or by a childishly innocent genius who just dreamed of being a little boy all his life. You're watching the Title Channel, and today, we will figure this whole thing out. We will start, oddly enough, not with the actual book about Peter Pan, but with James Matthew Barrie's earlier novel, The Little White Bird. Because it is here that our hero first appeared, and it's here that we learn the story of how Peter Pan became the boy who would never grow up. There, Peter's a newborn baby who runs away from his mother to Kensington Gardens to the magical fairies, having learned from her about what awaits him in adult life. Later, having had a good time, he decides to return home, but his mother's window turns out to be closed and she no longer is waiting for him because she has another child. What is hidden behind such a sad story? In fact, the child who escaped from the fairy crossed the border of two worlds and died for our world. The window, the symbol of which already appears for the first time in this story, is the memory of the mother and her connection with the child. As long as the window is open, the child is alive for her, and she does not lose hope for his return. But when Peter's spirit returns home, the window turns out to be closed, which means that the mother stopped waiting for him and gave all her love to another child. In the story of baby Peter Barrie uncovered his own childhood psychological trauma. He had an older brother, David, a golden boy whom his mother loved perhaps more than any of her other children. Unfortunately, he died in his teenage years, and it devastated Mrs. Barrie. She closed herself off from the world, began to ignore other children, and often repeated that her dead son would forever remain her beautiful, eternal boy who would never grow up. And little James at this time dreamed of at least a crumb of mother's love. Also, in the small story of Peter's first appearance, the main idea and dream that did not leave the author all his life was the idea of eternal childhood and the dream that James's mother would also close the window behind his dead brother and turn her heart to him. Now that we have found out the not-so-fun origin of this character, after whom the book Peter Pan was named, let's move on to the story itself. Peter Pan regularly flies to the window of the children's room of the Darling family house and, sitting on the windowsill, listens to fairy tales which Mrs. Darling tells her children, John, Michael, and Wendy, at night. Once, she noticed Peter. He tried to run away, but the children's nanny, St. Bernard Nana, managed to grab the boy's shadow with her teeth and tear it away. By the way, the presence of animals here is also difficult to call accidental, since animals have been considered guides to other worlds since ancient times. According to legends, they see the souls of the dead and even travel between alternate realities. And the fact that Nana growled when she saw the boy says that she tried to keep the children out of trouble. His charisma did not affect her. It would seem that if you're worried about your children, then you should do something about it, at least not keep the shadow of a ghost in their room. Her first thought was to hang the shadow outside like the wet laundry so Peter could pick it up and fly away, but Mrs. Darling did not do this because then the shadow would spoil the house's facade. Seriously, woman? Have you just sacrificed your children's safety for a pretty facade? So in the evening, before the children disappeared, the parents had to go out. Walking out of the house, the father put Nana on a chain outside. And now the question is, why didn't the candidate for the title of Mother of the Year, worried that the children were in danger, persuade her husband to leave the dog in the children's room? Nevertheless, the parents left, giving Peter Pan the opportunity to finally reclaim his shadow. From the very beginning, we note that eternal childhood was not his only strange feature. A shadow that lives its own life and can be separated from its owner, what is if not a picture of a split personality? In addition, modern psychology even named the syndrome in honor of Peter Pan. This term is associated precisely with a person who refuses to grow up. Often, Peter Pan syndrome is suffered by people who avoid typical adult responsibility and prefer to lead an easy and carefree lifestyle. But quite often, such people also have real mental problems, which over time can develop into real mental illness. For example, schizophrenia or multiple personality disorder. and forever young Peter is a vivid embodiment of such a diagnosis. And the desire to return his lost shadow, along with his fairy friend Tinkerbell, flies to the window of the nursery and begins to look for it. Here we again see the window as a vivid symbol. In esoteric teachings, windows belong to the list of portals through which a person can look into other worlds or dimensions, and their inhabitants can move to ours. Peter, together with the fairy, appears in the darling's house through the portal between the worlds. This is one of the facts in favor of the idea that Pan was not actually a boy, but a being from another world. Later, we learn that Peter was perfectly able to imitate other people's voices and any sounds, thus changing his personality. In addition, like the Norse god of deception Loki, he was also a trickster. The trickster is a fairly common archetype in mythology, characterized by breaking the accepted norms, often lying to play pranks for his own pleasure, and generally doing whatever he wants, regardless of the feelings of those around him. Just like Loki, making things up and lying was like breathing to Peter. Their similarity is not only in the changing of personalities, but also in cunning, treachery, increased egocentrism, narcissism, and readiness to lie all the time for their own benefit. They are both heroes and villains, depending on which situation is currently beneficial to them. While looking for a shadow, Peter meets the main character of the tale, the eldest daughter of the family, Wendy, and her brothers Michael and George. She helps him, sews a shadow to the boy's leg because his own attempts have been useless. He immediately appropriates the girl's successful idea, which becomes the first red flag of his unattractive side for her, increased vanity and egocentrism. Having learned that the girl knows many fairy tales and stories, Pan burns with a desire to drag her to his country of Neverland. Inventing and lying to Peter was like breathing, so he pictured his country to her in the brightest colors, the magical island of Neverland. From his story, Wendy learns that there's many amazing mythical and fairy tale creatures on his island, which makes her very excited. She also learns the fact that Peter will never grow up and never change, that he can fly and is the leader of the Lost Boys. But Wendy was a smart and prudent girl. She hesitated. She was alarmed by Peter's narcissism and the way he persistently persuaded her to fly with him. And the address at which he lived caused suspicions in a rational British woman. Neverland is around the second corner on the right and then straight ahead until morning. Like where? No post office will accept an envelope with such an address. And this, once again, confirms the location of Neverland somewhere in another dimension outside of our reality. So how did Pan manage to lure the girl to him? In fact, Wendy was the first girl he was interested in. That's why he made so much effort, and not because she was a girl. Sexual instincts in this infantile were completely absent. That's because she could bring something interesting into his life. To tell him, the Lost Boys, endless stories that he loved to hear so much. A little reminiscent of Scheherazade, who redeemed her life from the cruel king with fairy tales. So what about Wendy? The evening of their acquaintance was a turning point for her. This night was to be her last in their shared nursery. Later, her parents moved her to a separate room as a young lady. Perhaps if Peter had appeared on some other day, she would have not flown with him, and nothing would have happened. But the girl's family was a typical middle-class Victorian family, and Wendy grew up convinced that a woman's main mission in life is to take care of the house and children. This was taken advantage of by the insidious and selfish Peter, who told her about the unfortunate lost boys, orphans who had no mother, and whom she could take care of by flying with him to Neverland. As a real manipulator, he knew which strings to pull and easily awakened the savior syndrome in Wendy. Pan was cunning and had years of experience luring children with sweet promises. So he added more honey, tempting her with mermaids and fairies, with the mention of which Wendy immediately forgot all hesitation. Besides, Pan clearly awakened not only the maternal instinct in her. Wendy was at the age when girls hit puberty and already knew something not only about family, but also about other grown-up stuff. Immediately after meeting handsome Peter, she tried to kiss him. And he wasn't interested, because he didn't even know what a kiss was. And here's another disturbing question. Why were there no girls at all among the lost? According to Peter, girls seemed to be too smart to get lost, but he only said that to flatter Wendy, and he succeeded. Girls are simply not interesting to him because he gravitated to the company of boys. Peter needed a cheerful group, followers, faithful puppets and companions. And here again, the author's own strange inclinations towards the utopia of an endless boyhood peek out from around the corner. Even as an adult, he sought the company of small boys. Could not create a full-fledged family because, as biographers and many of Barrie's friends suspect, he had no desire for a sexual life with his wife. And just like the sweet talking of Peter, he had something to offer the boys. endless fairy tales, willingness to participate in their games and adventures, and absolutely fantastic ability, from a boy's point of view, to move his mustache, eyebrows, and ears in a funny way. This is how Barrie attached himself to the real prototype of the Peter Pan character, where in 1897, walking in the same Kensington Park, he met the boy brothers from the Davis family, among whom was Michael Davis. Later, the writer got to know their parents and eventually became part of this family, spending a lot of time with the 6 boys. It was Michael who became the object of his greatest admiration. Whether this admiration was platonic and innocent or whether it contained hidden desires, there's many assumptions. But there is a letter that Barrie wrote to Michael Davis on his 8th birthday, where the poem is followed by the caption, "Dear Michael, I'm very fond of you, but don't tell anybody." In addition, after the untimely death of Mom and Dad Davis, Barrie forged their will and listed himself as the primary guardian of the boys. Nowadays, Barrie would probably be immediately suspected of an unhealthy attraction to boys, but in those days, this friendship did not seem strange. In Victorian England, it was customary to portray such people as scary strangers and social outsiders. The myth was actively supported by respectable society because in this way it was possible to avoid the terrifying reality in which children can be subjected to violence even in the homes of the middle and upper class. Did Barrie really have perverse intentions towards Michael or the other boys? There's no direct evidence or confirmation of this. On the one hand, in Little White Bird, there is a creepy scene where the main character describes with trepidation how he went to bed with the little boy, helped him undress, and how this event excited him. On the other hand, the youngest of the Davis brothers, Nico, denied that Barrie had ever acted inappropriately as an adult. "I don't believe that Uncle Jim ever experienced what one might call a stirring in the undergrowth for anyone, man, woman, or child," he said. He was innocent, which is why he could write Peter Pan. Nevertheless, one thing is clear. The story of Peter, who never wanted to grow up, is also the story of Barrie himself, who, surrounded by young friends, ran away from adult life, and he tried to compensate for his lost childhood, which was stolen by the death of his brother. But let's return to the flow of our fairy tale. Wendy agreed to go with Peter on the condition that he would take Michael and George with him. He agreed, but he will note absolutely without enthusiasm. Why? It would seem that the larger his entourage, the merrier. More on that later. And for now, the flying boys sprinkled the children with fairy dust so that they could fly with him, and they would all fly to Neverland together. I wonder what kind of pollen you can use to transport yourself to fairyland. Wendy saw another red flag about Pan on the way, when it was too late to turn back. Every time, for some reason, he flew away from them for a long time. He seemed to forget who they were and why he was there. And here we'll pay attention to that set of strange signs that Peter Pan has already managed to show. A short memory is a characteristic of supernatural beings, inhabitants of the ether, because their life is practically eternal and there's no point in concentrating on the moment. Never ages, can fly, and separates its shadow. A ghost, a fairy, or a spirit. Who really was the eternally young Peter Pan? If you look in more detail, this question becomes clear. According to the book, he looks Wendy's age, about 11 to 12 years old. But according to the story, he ran away from his mother while playing with the fairies and ended up in their country a few days after he was born. So his spirit took a form that was convenient for him. Perhaps he was once real, but he died and forever remained young, went to his boyhood paradise in the form of Neverland, where, so that he could not be lonely there, he began to take the boys from Kensington Park, the one in London, from time to time. Take, that is, kidnap boys and take them to Neverland? Somehow it doesn't sound very good. And that's exactly how it was. When we arrive at Neverland together with the Darling's children, we see that the lost boys catch every word of their leader, obey every whim, are afraid to misbehave, depend on him in everything, and at the same time adore him and are ready to follow him on any adventure. In fact, they are his hostages because they would not be able to return home on their own even if they wanted to. What is it if not a description of Stockholm Syndrome, an unhealthy emotional connection between a tyrant and a victim? But he didn't pick up just any kid. According to Peter himself, he only picked up children who fell out of the strollers while the babysitters were looking the other way. If they didn't start looking for them within a week, then they were already going to Neverland with him. I wonder where they've been all this week, and what did they eat? And were these guys really not wanted? How is it possible for a baby to disappear from the cradle and no one was looking for them in a week? And where? In Kensington Gardens, where the middle and upper class walked their little ones? The answer here is simple. In fact, children died and were taken by the spirit of death named Peter Pan. This is easy to believe if you take into account the fact that the infant mortality rate in those days was very high, and the death of an infant in a dream happened quite often. The fairy Tinkerbell helped him in this dark business. She supplied Peter with magic pollen that gave him the ability to fly, and as a side effect, he introduced the insidious spirit into a state of euphoria and gullibility. As is known from ancient legends, fairies are not as cute magical creatures as you can imagine from Tinkerbell's appearance. Scottish tales suggest that they're fallen angels, real fiends, while the Welsh call the fairies the souls of the dead. It's quite logical that Peter, a spirit who takes dead boys to himself, has the same deceased supernatural powers as Tinkerbell in his company. On the pages of the book, she regularly shows the treachery, malice, and darkness of her nature. In addition, it is known from the same folklore that some fairies sometimes kidnapped human children or replaced them with their own. When the trio of darling children end up in Neverland, which is heaven, or maybe hell for the dead lost boys, we learn even more disturbing facts about the place. And it starts from the moment they arrive on the island. Immediately upon arrival, pirates shoot at them from a cannon, and Wendy is almost killed by an arrow from one of the lost boys. It is the fairy Tinkerbell, filled with jealousy of Wendy, who tries to kill her at the hands of the lost, giving them Peter's false order. Doesn't sound like a good fairy, does it? No one thought of disobeying him. They were so afraid of him. They were equally horrified when they realized their mistake and that the one whose arrow had hit Wendy was actually ready to die because he knew the strength of his leader's anger. Cute, nice boy? Really? Fortunately, everything ends well and Wendy survives. She meets the lost boys and they immediately start calling her mom because they don't remember their mothers for a long time. Peter steals from them not only life but also the memory of the past outside Neverland. Peter himself claims he does not need a mother, and this illustrates the author's resentment towards his own mother, who distanced herself from him. Peter gets involved with Wendy in a game of mom and dad they've become for the lost, but it's precisely while playing, because Pan turns everything happening into a game. Only out of a desire to try something new in life, Peter allows himself to imagine and pretend that he has some feelings for Wendy, and this cruelly wounds the girl, who starts falling in love. Wendy soon begins to recognize the cruel essence of the irresponsible and narcissistic eternal boy, and further stay on the island quickly dispels the last illusions. There are Indians and pirates who live on the island, whose leader is Captain Hook, Peter's mortal enemy. Fairies, amazing birds, and mermaids also live there, but it turns out this whole world is imprisoned precisely by Peter Pan, which once again confirms that he is the spirit of the place, the owner of his own dimension. When he flies away somewhere, life seems to stop there. Everything that exists there is created for his entertainment, even something that could kill him. For him, it's a game because he can't die. Spirits or gods do not die. He himself confirms this with the words that dying seems like a terribly big adventure. This dimension is Pan's world, full not only of beauty and unreal magic, but also of cruelty, violence, and blood. Children are cruel by nature, and Peter is an eternal child even more so. He's not just always young, he hates adult life and everything related to it, believing that with every exhalation of a child, an adult somewhere dies. He, overcome by this hatred, deliberately breathes as often as possible and kills them as much as he can. The Lost Boys are like cheap scapegoats. He doesn't care whether they die at the hands of pirates, wild animals, or by his hand when they displease him in some way. His underground house, by the way, is also a sign of being in another lower world, which clearly points to the fact that Peter was by no means an angel, and that Neverland Paradise for him could actually be hell for others. Everything depended only on him and his will. Have any of the Lost Boys ever managed to grow up in Neverland without being killed? Oddly enough, it's obvious that the pirates, the lifelong enemies of Peter and the Lost, were just those guys who managed to grow up and escape to Captain Hook. They forgot how to fly because they became adults. They can no longer get home, so they constantly swim near the shore of Neverland. Peter's biggest enemy, Captain Hook, is the personification of adulthood. That's why he's described as a cruel, heartless creature, and that's why Penn hates him so much, not just because he's a pirate. In terms of cruelty, treachery, and ruthlessness, he's equal to Peter. Barrie invests his distaste for adulthood in this dishonorable captain. Another source of hatred is that Captain gave home to those who escaped Peter's punishment, the adult Losts. It's likely that Hook is the very first lost boy who escaped death at the hands of Peter when he grew up. He also has several reasons to hate Peter Pan. The first and the main one, Peter once took little James Hook away from home and family. Judging by the text, the family was very difficult because if it were discovered what kind of family he really was from, it would shake England even today. He managed to escape, somehow returned to the real world, but life was already broken, nothing worked out, and he returned to take revenge on Penn. In addition, thanks to Peter, he has an iron hook instead of his hand, and his hand was thrown into the crocodile's mouth by the cute prankster boy. Having tasted human flesh once, the crocodile now follows Hook everywhere. The captain is alerted to his presence by a wristwatch, which he also swallowed. This clock seems to count down the time that Hook still has left to live. Because he's an adult, and unlike Penn, his life, even here in Neverland, must end someday. And the crocodile is both literally and figuratively death, which follows him everywhere. Having admired the magical world a little, Wendy began to notice the dark reverse side of that place and its inhabitants. Fairies turned out to be not so cute, mermaids dangerous, lost boys unfortunate lost souls. The pirates were constantly preparing some tricks and they became more and more dangerous. In addition to all this, Peter continued to flatly refuse to ever change, showing more and more hypertrophied childlike features. But most of all, Wendy was frightened by the fact that the younger brothers, like the other lost ones, began to gradually forget home. Such was the charm of Peter in Neverland. And then, fearing to lose her own memory, she decides to return. It is at this moment that the events on the island reach the peak of drama. Captain Hook kidnaps Wendy, captures the lost boys, and tries to poison Peter. But thanks to Tinkerbell, who takes the poison for him, Pan survives. And we're convinced that the evil fairy's love for him is so strong that she even is ready to sacrifice her life for him. Very life story, right? When a woman falls madly in love with a beautiful, charismatic narcissist who loves no one but himself in this world and because of this love gets into trouble. Moreover, barely reviving from the shock, Peter rushes to save another person of the female gender, the earthly girl Wendy. It should be noted here that when Peter did something good, he did it not out of nobility, but because it gave him a reason to be proud of something and to brag about. Just as he once appropriated the idea of Wendy to sow his shadow because only he can have the most wonderful ideas. By the way, his ability to reincarnate helps him defeat Hook and the pirates. This time, it is an imitation of the ticking sound of a clock in the crocodile's belly, which Captain Hook was scared to death of. In the end, Hook becomes a victim of his arch-nemesis, a crocodile that once bit off his hand. But let's return to the main character and a very important question. How did the darling children manage to escape the spell of oblivion and return home literally from another world? The fact is that there were 3 of them and they could remind each other of Mom and Dad. This is why Peter was very reluctant to take Wendy's brothers with him, not just herself. He knew there was a risk involved, and so it happened. The window, the symbolism of which we already discussed at the beginning of our analysis, clearly appears here as well. Living on the island, Wendy did not worry too much about her parents because she knew they would always keep the window open so the children could always get home. The window is a symbol of the hope and faith of the parents that the children will come out of the coma and the only way back from Neverland, which remained in Wendy, Michael, and George. Peter's persistent attempts to close this window are his desire to keep Wendy forever, breaking the connection with his parents and real physical life. That's why he flew to the Darlings from time to time to check if they'd not forgotten about the children. But the children's thirst for life and love for their parents turned out to be stronger. And then, as if to confirm that Peter was an otherworldly entity and the children visited the world of the dead, there was the episode of their return home. When Peter Pan saved everyone from the pirates and the Darlings went home, the Lost Boys also wanted to go back with them because Wendy convinced them that her parents would only be happy for them and welcome them into the family. So to get everyone back to London, Peter Pan, using the power of fairy dust, lifted an entire pirate ship into the sky. But for what reason? Absolutely all the children, the Lost and the Darlings at that time, knew how to fly. However, ordinary human souls cannot simply move between worlds. This ship, like the Flying Dutchman, a ghost ship capable of crossing the border of worlds and ruled by dead souls, could do just that, deliver them to the Darlings' house. Interestingly, all the boys on the ship dressed up as pirates, as if finally accepting the fact of growing up, just like Captain Hook and his crew once did. It might seem that Peter was too easy on letting Wendy go with the Lost Boys, but in fact, he thought everything through perfectly. If Peter had not let Wendy go, he would have been a villain in her eyes. So he decided to bring everyone to the Darling house, but to close the window so that Wendy would think that her mother was no longer waiting for her. The only thing that could convince Peter to abandon this plan was Mrs. Darling's tears, which awakened something human in him. Peter relented, but made a deal with Wendy, that she would fly to him once a year for some kind of spring cleaning. Let's agree, a deal with an otherworldly being is a fairly common situation in fairy tales and legends, when the hero gets out of a difficult situation and gets what they want, subject to certain conditions. In addition, he agreed because he understood that Wendy was already almost an adult, almost a woman, an evil capable of destroying the magical world of the boys' brotherhood. In the end, the Darling children returned to the real world to their parents, and with them, the Lost Boys returned to the family. But why were they not returned to their own parents? Why did the Darlings adopt them? Sadly, the boys' physical bodies were buried a long time ago, and they returned to this world as ghosts who will now live in the darlings' home. Parents gladly accepted their children with all their fantasies and imaginary friends, if only they were alive and healthy. This is not a very childish and bright fairy tale, if you look at it from a slightly different, less usual perspective. Disney cartoons have taught us to look at old fairy tales in an exclusively positive way, removing all the dubious and poignant moments. But in fact, every fairy tale, if you're not afraid to look into its dark side, hides hidden violence, betrayal, pain, and creepy secrets. Because all fairy tales are a crooked mirror of our world that sees both sides of it. To learn more about the dark meaning of familiar stories from childhood, subscribe to this channel and click on the bell. The fairy tale has ended, but there will surely be another after it.